All right, we are back and ready to talk some monopoly and antitrust here. This would be chapter 4 in your textbook. I got my green shoes on again. You can see those, ready to roll, nice and bright green here. Gives me a little bit of energy. It's not the same as when I'm in the front of the classroom with you, but we will try to do our best here to explain some monopoly and antitrust. So this is a really important topic, as you probably already realized, as it relates to the sports industry. We've kind of started with monopoly. You've seen this graph before, where we've got the marginal cost at basically zero when we're thinking about the price of, or the cost of providing another ticket. It's at zero until we get to this point out here where we reach the capacity in the stadium, and then the cost of providing another additional ticket once we're at capacity is really high, right? We've got to add to our stadium. So we've got our marginal cost line here that we're used to. We've got our demand line, that's their D is here, our demand line, and we've got a marginal revenue line when we're talking about a monopoly that is actually below the demand line. So we're going to come back to this idea, and I'm going to explain it a little bit further by sort of dividing the economic activity, which happens below the demand line here, into some different sections, and starting to think about who is getting more for their money, or who's getting the surplus, to use our economist language, who's getting the surplus in this transaction. So when we think about a monopoly situation, first of all, probably intuitive to most of you that monopolists are going to charge more. They're the only supplier, that's what a monopoly is, of a particular product. That enables them to charge more, and there's going to be less production than there would be if we had perfect competition. So let me just get my pen here. So this subscript here is C, stands for in a competitive market, perfectly competitive. Our M's here stand for in a monopoly, right? Our price is greater in a monopoly than it is when there's perfect competition. We see that here, the price, if there's perfect competition, and this was our marginal cost line, and this was our marginal, or the demand line would be the marginal revenue line. If it was perfect competition, we'd produce a quantity C, and the price would actually be zero in this instance. But in a monopoly, the profit maximizing position is where this is our marginal cost line here, where that crosses the marginal revenue line. That tells us our quantity, QM, quantity in a monopoly. And we go trace this up to the demand line and over to the price line to find the price in a monopoly. So you see higher price, greater price in a monopoly situation than in a perfect competition situation, and you see, right, less quantity produced in a monopoly situation. So higher prices, what's the consumer effect? We're all consumers. Do we like higher prices? No, of course not, right? Higher prices, thumbs down, bad. But if we're producers, if we're the ones producing the product and we're the sole producer, this is a monopoly, we like the fact that prices are higher. This is a good thing if we're the producer. So what's the overall economic effect in this situation? Meaning, what's happening here? Is it good for the economy to have monopolies, or not good overall? Well, let's break this out a little bit. First, let's think about that perfectly competitive market. So we have the same graph. We've taken a couple lines off of our graph here, because we're only going to think about the competitive market here. So we've got our demand line right here. We still have our marginal cost line here. Our demand line in a perfectly competitive market is also our marginal revenue line, because for each additional product that we sell along this demand line, our marginal revenue is equal to the price that we sell it at. So remember, demand equals margin of revenue in a competitive market. Our quantity produced is QC, which is point E on this particular rendition of the graph right here. Our price at that point is 0. Our consumer surplus is this triangle here. Can't see my traced lines because it's the same color. But it's A, C, E. All of this is consumer surplus. The reason that we say, or we indicate this is consumer surplus, is because the demand line's here. So there's people on this demand line. Let's say right here, for instance. If we trace this over here, this might be $10 on our price axis here. So there's somebody that represents this demand. They were willing to pay $10 for this product, let's say a ticket to a certain game. But in a perfectly competitive market, the ticket's provided at $0. So the consumer surplus in this case is $10, goes to the consumer. I was willing to pay $10 to go to this game. I didn't have to pay anything. That's a $10 surplus for me, right? I keep my $10. So that's, again, everything in this triangle becomes a consumer surplus in a competitive market. Anybody willing to pay more than what the price actually was gets a surplus as a consumer. All right, so now what about a monopoly? Okay, so now we're in a monopoly. We see this graph come back again, these lines come back. Our marginal revenue line here we've seen has shifted below our demand line, which is this line here. Because in a monopoly, we're the only provider of a product. So in order to sell additional products as we move out in quantity, we know we have to sell them for a little bit less money to get that next consumer, that next consumer, that next consumer. And since we're the only supplier, it means that we have to sell those previous units that we were going to sell at more money up here. We've got to sell them for a little bit less. We've got to. That's the assumption, because this consumer would not keep paying $20 for their ticket if they knew that the exact same ticket was going to somebody else for $10, right? So I have to sell all my tickets for $10 at whatever quantity I provide. I'm selling them all at $10. So in that case, that's why our marginal revenue line is below our demand line in a monopoly. So our marginal revenue line comes out. It tells us we're going to produce this amount, where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost. Trace up here, go over. Let's say this is $10. Okay. There we go. Now we still have a consumer surplus, but now it's A, B, F triangle. This triangle right here. Right? This is consumer surplus, because there's still that person up here on the demand line that was willing to pay $20 or $15 for their ticket. They only had to pay $10, so they got a $5 surplus if they were willing to pay $15. So there's still some consumer surplus, but not as much as there used to be, right? Because this monopolist is only selling at this quantity, which means that all of these tickets out here are not being sold, right? This monopolist is not providing these quantity of tickets because they've decided that they're going to sell only at this quantity, right? So all of this becomes our deadweight loss because it never gets sold. The rectangle here is the additional profits of the monopolist. So they're capturing some of the surplus that would have gone to the consumer in a competitive market. Now it goes to that monopolist because they've charged $10 when in a perfectly competitive market they would have charged $0 because there's zero marginal cost out here where the demand line crosses the marginal cost line. All right, so we've got less produced, less consumed. Some consumers don't end up getting their product. There's no economic transaction here. That's why it's called a deadweight loss. So hopefully that helps you. Now remember, we talked about this earlier when we talked about the Colorado Rockies, I think was the example that we used. So we've seen this graph earlier. Same graph. We're just kind of breaking it down in a little bit different way to think about where the profits are going and help us understand kind of the effects of this monopoly on the economy economically. So how might we measure what consumer surplus is captured by the consumer versus the producer? Well, let's again think about a sporting event, price per ticket. We're going to think about a monopoly situation here. So we're in a particular market. Let's say there's only one professional football team, for instance, here in Metro Cincinnati. Of course, we have the Bengals. It's the only professional football team. If we want to see pro football, that's our only choice. By league regulations, they have a monopoly within 75 miles. No other teams can be put within 75 miles. No other football teams, NFL teams, can be put within that radius of the Bengals. So they have got that monopoly. So here's their demand line. They've got a marginal cost of 0, providing additional tickets all the way out to some capacity quantity when their line would go straight up, their marginal cost line, right? Got demand. We've got their marginal revenue line, which is below the demand line, okay? Now, I know that the Bengals have different ticket price levels, and one of the reasons that they have that is to try and capture even more of this deadweight loss for the team, right? So they've created different ticket pricing levels so they can still capture some of this demand. But we're not going to go into that kind of detail yet where it gets more confusing. We're going to stick with pretending that all the seats are equal in terms of the benefit that they give the consumer, right? I know there's different levels and different distances from the field and different amenities. We're going to pretend every seat is equal in that regard that they sell. And hence they only have one price, right? And they would, in a monopoly, to maximize profit, they would determine that price by looking at where does marginal revenue cross marginal cost. That would be right here. They would trace this quantity output line up to whatever the demand line is at that quantity output, and then over to the price or ticket price part. And in this example, it's $20, right? So that's what they're going to sell their seats at. Now, they could lower their price more, and they could sell more seats because we know demand still exists out here. So they could lower it to $10, and they could sell, whatever this particular quantity at $10 might be. But the assumption that we're making that in order to do that, they have to lower all of their tickets to $10. So all of those people that were willing to buy at $20 or at $30 up here, right? They only have to pay $10, right? That's again why this marginal revenue line slopes down in this way. And once that marginal revenue line crosses marginal costs, they don't want to sell anymore, right? They don't want to lower the price anymore moving out on this demand line because then they're cutting into their profits. This is the max profit point for a monopolist, okay? I know I'm really hammering that home in your mind, but sometimes it can be a difficult concept to grasp for some people, so I want to explain it as much as I can here. All right, so we got $20 ticket price. Now, if we were in the classroom, I'd ask you, how much are you willing to pay to go to a Bengals game? You know, for me, I like professional football, not as much as I like college football, but I enjoy it. Depending on the day and the opponent a little bit might matter to me. I think I would shell out at least say $30 for a Bengals ticket. A lot of you might be even more bigger professional football fans. Let's say you might shell out $50. Some of you might say, no, I'm not much of a football fan at all. I'd only shell out $10. And maybe there's even one or two of you that are like, I can just watch a game on TV. I have no interest in going out to Paul Brown Stadium. I wouldn't pay anything, right? $0. Okay, so you've got these different people that fall in different spots on the demand curve, right? In terms of what they're willing to pay. All right, so the Bengals have set the price at $20. So for me, $30 consumer, this is me, Joe. I am going to capture how much surplus here? Well, I'm going to actually capture $10. In surplus, it means I get to keep $10 of my $30 in my pocket because the tickets only cost $20, but I was willing to pay up to $30, right? So that's surplus. I was maybe up here if we make this the $30 mark. I would have paid up here, but I only had to pay $20. I'm in this area here that's consumer surplus, right? Because Bengals are only charging $20. Now, this person at $10, they're not going to buy a ticket, right? They're out here on the demand curve. So the Bengals decided, well, actually that would be over here on the axis. So $10 is where you are here. The Bengals decided they're not going to provide tickets at $10. If they did provide tickets at $10, they'd be out at this quantity. If they decided not to, this person's out in this space, which is the dead weight loss, right? This transaction doesn't occur. Then we had another person, fictitious person at 50. They were way up here, right? They've got $30 in surplus. So you see kind of how this situation works out, right? All right. So what about, so the profit maximizing output sets marginal revenue equal to what? Hopefully I've tattooed this on your brain by now. It's marginal cost. However, lots of sports economists have shown that teams will produce too much quantity, meaning they will produce, let's go back to our graph here for a second, they will produce at quantities out here past this point where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost. So marginal revenue is below zero at this point. Now, why would they do that, right? By selling that additional ticket, they're actually cutting into their profits a little bit, if we assume that they had to lower all the previous ticket prices, which I know that's not exactly true. But why would they sell at that point? Well, are they failing to maximize profit? Unlikely. Remember, their profits are not just coming from selling tickets, right? They're selling a lot of other goods, hats, right? Don't you miss this old Brewers hat? That was a nice hat. They're selling hats. They're selling concessions, Coke, hot dogs. They're certainly selling some beer, right? Parking. They're selling that as well. Even more so, they're also, well, I shouldn't say more so, but in addition to these complementary goods that they sell, complementary to tickets, they're also getting people into the stadium. And from a marketing standpoint, we know that if we can get you into the stadium, or if I can get you into my location, or if I can get you to visit my website, you're much more likely to return to the stadium later. Because once you go the first time to that first athletic event, you know how the parking goes, you know how the traffic flows, you know once you get into the stadium kind of where the different sections are, you know what's available at the concession stand, right? A lot of those obstacles for that first time visitor are overcome once you get there one time. Excuse me. So that's another reason that owners are willing to sell tickets at a little bit beyond that marginal revenue equals marginal cost point. That's the profit maximizing position if we're only thinking about ticket sales for a particular game. All right, let's talk about monopoly power in Europe. So some of you, I bet, are soccer fans, maybe international soccer fans, or English soccer fans, Spanish soccer fans, La Liga, English Premier League, Bundesliga. I don't know, maybe there's some German soccer fans watching this. So monopoly is a lot different situation once we get outside of the U.S., or even once we get outside of the 4 major U.S. sports leagues. And even within those 4 major leagues, there's certain leagues that have much more monopoly power. For instance, the NFL and Major League Baseball have much more monopoly power than the NBA and the NHL, which still have some monopoly power in North America, but there's other leagues around the world that are not as good as the NBA or the NHL, but pretty competitive professional leagues, right? MLS has even less monopoly power, right? Because you've got all of these other soccer leagues that, yes, it's harder for me to attend games, so they've got a monopoly from an attendance standpoint for Major League Soccer or the highest level of professional soccer attending a game in a particular country. They've got a monopoly in that regard. But because of all the channels we get, I can watch a lot of English Premier League games if I want. I can watch some Bundesliga games. I can watch Real Madrid, Barcelona, Atletico Madrid. I can watch some of these La Liga teams. So it's not a pure monopoly in that regard. And even if we think about, let's think about the English Premier League, because it's an open league like most international leagues, or foreign leagues, I should say, leagues outside of North America, are open leagues. You've got promotion and relegation versus our leagues that are mostly closed, right? Teams don't move in and out of the NFL. It's pretty much set. What happens is you've got much less monopoly power in those leagues that are open leagues, because you end up with 5 or 6 teams in the major metropolitan areas. Like, this is from last year, I think. So all of these teams might not still be in the Premier League. But anyway, there were 6 EPL teams in London at one time, and that's because there's a lot of money in London, right? So the lower level teams based in different areas in London, some of these teams really close to each other, Tottenham and Arsenal are very close to each other, but those particular clubs, right, are able to, there's lots of money in London. They're able to attract fans to come out to games. They're able to sell sponsorships to corporations or in the neighborhood, or even regionally or even nationally, right, which enables them to buy better players, which gets them promoted eventually to the Premier League, right? So if a city's big enough to support multiple teams, it will eventually get multiple teams in that upper level if it's an open league like English Premier League. What about a natural monopoly? Right? So we've talked about North American leagues having somewhat of a monopoly, and it's artificial, right? The NFL creates an artificial rule of a 45 or 75 mile radius. MLB has a, I think it's 50 or 60 mile radius, something like that, that exists. And so if new teams come within your radius, which doesn't happen very often, but then you get compensated by the league if you as an owner agree to allow that to happen. For instance, I think it's the Angelos that owned the Orioles when the league put the Nationals there, which is in their Baltimore's restricted area. So anyway, these are artificial monopolies, right, that we have in our league. So are there situations where there's a natural monopoly? Like, when would that ever happen? That could be where you have low demand relative to the efficient scale for the producer, right? So let's look at this on a graph, right? All right. So this would be the situation where a single supplier provides the best situation to meet the demand because they can realize all of the economies of scale in producing to the demand point, right? And they can pass on those lower costs to consumers, right? They reach a certain economy of scale, so their production costs are lower, and they can move that on. If it wasn't a monopoly, if you had multiple producers, none of them could really reach that economy of scale where they had lower production costs, and none of that savings would get passed on to the consumer, right? So in this situation, you know, some teams, owners have argued, well, sports is a natural monopoly, not an artificial monopoly, because you have a really high fixed cost. And we know that fixed costs are really high in sports, right? Because when we looked at costs in the last chapter, and we went through the list and we said, what's a variable cost, what's a fixed cost here? Almost all fixed costs, right? So we know that it's high fixed costs, We know that it's pretty low marginal costs. We've even talked about it being zero. We see this marginal cost line out here, which means in this situation, the more that you produce, the further out that you get in quantity, the more that the average cost goes down, right? Because I have to take my fixed cost. If it's fixed, the cost is the same whether I'm producing 10 or whether I'm producing 15,000, whatever our scale is here on the quantity line. Our fixed cost is the same, right? But I can divide the fixed costs over a lot higher quantity if I'm producing out here, so my average continues to go down. My average cost, right, continues to go down, right? So is this, is this true? Are pro teams a natural monopoly? If it was a natural monopoly, you would not need any barriers to entry, right? If teams, and this is what most sports economists would say, if teams were a natural monopoly, there'd be no need to have a 75-mile radius where no other pro teams can pop up, right? Why would you need that artificial barrier? If it was a natural monopoly, the market itself would work it out so that there'd only be one team in a one team of a certain sport in a particular metropolitan area. But instead, the leagues have created these barriers to entry. So what about monopsony? Right? So monopoly is one seller. Monopsony is not one seller, it's what? One buyer. Right? Let's fill this in here. One buyer. Just like a monopoly seller will produce less and charge more, when there's only one buyer, that buyer will pay less and will also buy less, right? So where does this happen in sports? Where is there only one buyer? Well, for a long time, none of you are going to remember this most likely, but for a long time in sports, that's what existed in the labor market. Because there used to be a reserve clause that tied players to their particular team even after their contract expired. In which case there's only one buyer of your labor. Once you're drafted, that's the team that you're stuck with basically forever. And through the decades, starting in the 1950s or so, Earl Toulson was a player in the Yankee system and sued the Yankees to try and get released from their reserve clause so that he could sign with another team. He ended up losing that lawsuit in the 50s. It's a long story. You can read about it in the chapter if you want, the legal aspects of it. But essentially, the judge that was ruling in the case was a huge baseball fan and didn't want to upset kind of the balances of power. The judge also later became commissioner of the league. Funny how that works out sometimes. Curt Flood later sued again, again unsuccessful, but in the 1990s Congress passed the Curt Flood Act, which created, by that point, players had collectively bargained free agency, but basically what it did is it gave players a little bit more rights in terms of determining their own movement between different teams. And that's also the reason why, and some of you might realize this, that when there's a players' strike or if there's a lockout by the owners, if the players want to sue the owners for an antitrust, and we'll talk about antitrust in just a second, an antitrust violation, they have to disband the league. So the Curt Flood Act, I think it was 1997, said that labor market trumps antitrust law. I said labor market. Labor law trumps antitrust law. Labor law is where collective bargaining happens, right? And so the union, the players' union, obviously collaborates on their side. All the players collaborate together and negotiate together. If they're negotiating as a union, then the teams are all allowed to negotiate together. There's no antitrust violation for the teams doing that. But once the union disbands, then there's no longer a union. So theoretically, the teams can't also collectively bargain as well. So that's the basis of that type of lawsuit that you might have heard about in the past. European broadcast contracts, another example of monopsony for a while. And the reason these were a monopsony was because a lot of the broadcast networks were state-owned, owned by the government for a long time. And so even though they might have had 2 or 3 channels, all 3 channels were owned by the government. European soccer leagues or clubs, because those teams didn't until recently pool their broadcast rights. A European soccer club goes to a network and says, hey, we want to sell our games to you to be broadcast on TV. There's only one buyer. So in that instance, the government says, okay, well, yeah, we'd like to broadcast those games. We'll give you £100,000, right? Or $100,000, euros, whatever. There's nobody else. There's only one buyer. So they can't, the teams, the clubs, are not able to go to, well, let me see what this station would offer or this station would offer, right? And only after media privatization happened across Europe did we see TV rights start to really escalate like they did here in North America or have for a long time. There's a picture of the judge that I just mentioned. Landis was his name. So some of you will remember this if you took sports law, or you might even remember this from a business law class, this antitrust law, which is based on the Sherman Act. So there's 2 clauses, 2 main clauses. Clause 1 prohibits kind of collective action or colluding. Teams are not allowed to, are not supposed to collude together to create only one buyer in the player market, right? So according to this, it would be illegal, say, for teams to kind of come together and all the owners agree, hey, let's not sign this particular player because he's just a troublemaker and has been talking bad about the league, right? That would be a violation in the Sherman Act, because you'd have these different teams colluding not to sign a particular player. Or they could collude to say, hey, we don't want to pay any any player more than $3 million a season, right? And if all the owners agree to that, they could implement that. However, that would be a violation of Clause 1 of the Sherman Act. Well, you might say, okay, Dr. Cobbs, but there's salary caps. Isn't that colluding and capping the salaries that you're going to pay? You're right, and that's where it comes in what I was talking about a couple minutes ago, the collective bargaining agreement. So the Players Association agrees to a salary cap as part of the collective bargaining. They're going to allow for a salary cap. Usually they're going to make the owners agree to provide a certain percentage of sport-related revenue to players. So that might be 50, 55, 52%, something like that, right? That's going to be in the collective bargaining agreement. A lot of times players, the union will also bargain for a floor, right? If you're going to put a salary cap in, you got to put a salary floor in, so teams don't just kind of free ride, pay a lot less than they should in salary, and then just make money from revenue sharing within the league, right? The Players Association does not like that. Clause 2 attacks individual actions. So individual meaning firm actions on their own, but leads to anti-competitive behavior. And that's where you've seen some of the tech companies get sued in the last several years for antitrust. One of the most famous ones was several years ago now, but Microsoft providing Internet Explorer in their operating system and making it difficult for other internet browsers to be installed. A lot of you don't remember that, but that's how it used to be in the Windows system. They had some workings that made it difficult to install and run other browsers as your default browser. So that was found to be in violation of Clause 2 of the Sherman Act by Microsoft, and they were no longer allowed to do that. And then once that happened, or that ruling happened, then we saw Firefox and Google Chrome and several other browsers begin to become popular, much more popular than Internet Explorer. So do sports leagues violate either one of these? Well, in some ways they do coordinate. They definitely collude in making rules, schedules, in drafts, broadcasting, merchandise sponsorship, as you see here. So why is this allowed? Well, for one, it's what I just described. It's collectively bargained with the players. But in baseball, baseball has an antitrust exemption. Granted, a long time ago, Judge Landis, the picture that we just saw, I think I said he was the judge in the Toulson case. That's not true. He was the judge, he was the judge in baseball's antitrust exemption case. So anyway, there was a third professional baseball league back in the early 1900s called the Federal League. That was after the National League was formed, and then the American League, and then the Federal League was formed. It sued Major League Baseball, went to court in Judge Landis's court. He kind of sat on the case for a while. During that time, the Federal League folded. So in that way, he really helped baseball. He was a big baseball fan, like I mentioned before. However, one owner of a Federal League team refused to settle, goes to the Supreme Court, and the court eventually rules that baseball is an exhibition, not commerce. So it's not subject to antitrust law. And that rule pretty much stands for decades and decades and decades. And of course the other leagues want an antitrust exemption too, right? They're like, hey, this is great. Baseball doesn't have to worry about being sued under antitrust law. But later courts, while they didn't rescind baseball's antitrust exemption, they were not willing to provide an exemption to the other professional leagues. And so what you ended up seeing was rival leagues did pop up in other sports, and the dominant league eventually merges with the rival league and takes some of its teams, is what happened. Most recently we saw that with the NHL and the WHL and the NBA and the ABA in the 70s. NFL did get a broadcast rights exemption, which was eventually expanded to the other leagues. That's what allows the leagues to sell their TV rights collectively. All right, that is the end of that chapter. That's just the first part of Chapter 4. We will look at ticket price segmentation in the second part of Chapter 4, and we'll do that in our next video.